Part of what we're going to spend our next few minutes doing is kind of taking a bit of a deep dive into understanding what in the world is happening in our culture. I think if you're like me, if you are married, if you have children, if you live in America today, you're starting to realize that some things are changing in the winds, right? The air that's blowing feels a little bit different than maybe it did when you were a child, like me. Or maybe you're seeing it in your children's lives, maybe more than yours. Or maybe you live in certain regions of the country where you're starting to wonder whether you should announce yourself as a Christian or announce yourself as somebody who actually goes to church, because you start to get the glares. Your neighbors look at you a little funny, a little weird. They're kind of like, man, you're a Christian? Are you pretty extreme? Like, what's your views on this and that? And all of a sudden, the church is finding itself in a very different moment than maybe it's been prepared for. Part of why we launched our organization Q years ago, I'd been a part of Catalyst for many years and really enjoyed all that meant to the church, and just trying to help younger leaders appreciate leadership and just understand what leadership was about, what it meant to be a spiritual leader, what it meant to try to lead teams, and so on and so forth. But in about 2007, it became very clear to me that part of what we needed to be doing is preparing the church for the days ahead. Trying to understand, where is this culture going? Where is our youth going? What is it about what we've been doing that they're just not buying anymore? And it was a sober reality to start to understand through research, through study, through a ton of time with people who just aren't Christians, to start to recognize some of the dynamics at play that we as the church must be in the middle of. And so for me, it gets exciting when we start thinking about this challenge. I'm a bit entrepreneurial. I don't know if some of you in here are entrepreneurs, ever maybe started your own business. Maybe some of you are church planters. Maybe you sort of have something going on the side, and you think in an entrepreneur way. You go, there's a problem. I'm going to try to find a really great way to solve it. Well, that's sort of how my mind operates. And so as I started to understand the problem, I got pretty excited about the opportunity for the church. What was exciting to me was to realize that over the last couple hundred years, we've had more conversion growth in our churches than any other time in history. More people have raised their hand and said, I want to be a Christian. But when you measure how that's affecting our culture, at the same rate of increase in conversion, we see decrease in our ability to actually shape the way people are thinking, living, what they care about, what they value. And so now we find ourselves in 2015 in the midst of a chaotic moment. And I hope by the end of our time you feel encouraged that there is actually a way forward here that brings hope, that allows us as the church to continue to be the light that we've been called to be in the midst of dark places. A message that begins with us, not with someone else out there needing to change, but with us. And hopefully practically encouraged about how the role that you're playing, whatever that might be, whether you're a pastor, executive pastor, whether you work in the technology department, whether you're designing graphics, whether you're an engineer, no matter what role you're playing, there's a role for the church today like never before. But it starts by us understanding our moment. You see, one of the things the latest research has shown in America, for example, 53% of Americans believe there is an actual standard of right and wrong, something's true, something's false. But guess what? 47% of Americans say there is no standard. That right and wrong is something that over time evolves, it changes. Something might be right today, 10 years from now, I'm going to think that's wrong, okay? So it's very relative. You've heard about relativistic ideas. Well, it's here, 50-50. And you wonder why there's so much debate in our culture. You wonder why in media we see a constant, the poles getting all of the energy, sort of the extremes, and clashing with one another. Because there is a literal clash happening between what we believe. You see, if you start with a basis where there's a complete difference between what's moral and immoral, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's evil, and you can't agree on that, you're in the midst of some chaos. And so as a church, we have to start to understand, well, what does that mean? How are people engaging with us? How are they operating? There's these 3 social rules that I think are actually very helpful that will give you a sense of how the world is currently thinking. It's the air that we're all breathing, essentially. And the rules are this. They're these new rules of social engagement. The first one is this: one may not criticize someone's life choices or behaviors. Someone may not criticize another's life choices or behaviors, okay? Now, if any of you are pastors or you're part of a church, kind of on Sunday morning in a service, that's a little bit of what you're doing. Now, you're not just criticizing people. You're not just saying, hey, you're wrong, or condemning people. But what I mean is by teaching a standard of truth, of saying, hey, this is right, this is wrong, undoubtedly you're criticizing life choices and behavior. Every one of us should feel that criticism. A few years ago, I was invited out to Stanford University to be a part of a public conversation with a gentleman named Gene Robinson. Now, Gene Robinson, you maybe have heard this name, and in a moment I think you'll remember who he is. He was the first Episcopal bishop to be consecrated who was gay with the Episcopal Church. So on his 10-year anniversary, I was invited out to have a conversation with him about the future of the church and how it's engaging the marriage discussion, sexuality, gay marriage, so on and so forth. He is an advocate for gay marriage within the church. I am not an advocate for that. Now, I realize in this room, some people may disagree. The point of this story isn't that. The point is this, that Gene and I, as we were having our conversation, one thing he said to me, he said, the Catholic Church for years has told me that I'm intrinsically disordered. And I just can't bear to hear that. That's not something that resonates with me. It's condemning. And as he said it, it just kind of in me woke up, and I go, wait, Gene, I'm intrinsically disordered as well. That's kind of the point. As human beings, every single one of us are intrinsically disordered. And the good news of the gospel is that we can be redeemed from that. We can get back to understanding how God's designed us to be, who He's designed us to be, and we can live into that. Well, in a culture that now says you can't criticize someone's life choices or behavior, anything you say that to them feels negative creates a bit of a wall. Now, we can disagree all day long about whether that's good or bad, or we might all just say, that's really bad. That's not a good thing that people are so easily offended. But it is the way it is. And so as a church, we have to understand that's how people are feeling. The second rule of social engagement. One may not behave in a way that coerces or causes harm to others. Okay, this is another challenge for us, right? In the church, sometimes what you're teaching coerces a group of people to think a certain way that in today's moment could be considered as harm to others. So how do we deal within that dynamic? The third rule, which I think everybody will easily agree with, is one may not engage in a sexual relationship with someone without his or her consent. Okay, this is just one of those cultural rules. And the point of these three rules is understanding when you break these rules, you are the enemy. When you break these rules, you're the one who's the evil one. Now, a good example would have been back a few months ago, the Bill Cosby kind of episode, right? Where all the news covered this horrific things that were going on with Bill Cosby, where he drugged women, right? And did not have consensual sex with them. And why did everybody have outrage about that? Obviously, it was despicable. But the other reason is the new morality of our culture says this is the one thing you can't do. You can't do that. And everybody agreed with it. And so you saw the whole culture rise up and castigate Bill Cosby, right? So that's how these rules work. And I just want to give you kind of a functional understanding of that so that as you start to encounter these in your church with people that you're engaging with, it helps you understand why they react the way they might react to some of the things that you may be talking about or how you're communicating them. You know, we live in a new time, a new kind of public square. I just want to help you see the world we're living in a little bit more before we kind of dig into, okay, how does the church move forward in this? And so we call the public square, it's more of a technical term, but essentially where there's all kinds of public interaction. That could be online now through commenting. It could be Facebook. That's a public square. But it used to just be like the town center, where everybody would come do their marketplace business, eat, have town hall meetings, go to church, go to school, everywhere we intersect with other people. Well, huge shifts have started to happen between the old public square, probably the one that existed, let's say, in the 1970s, and the new public square that we live in today. Let me give you some of these ideas and how they juxtapose with one another. The first is, the old public square used to be homogeneous, a Judeo-Christian public square. Everybody kind of agreed on what was right and wrong, right? People wanted to be good. Today, it's diverse and it's pluralistic. Christians no longer have a corner on the market. Every faith has a seat at the table. That's the new dynamics. Second, the old 1970s public square was reflective and could be described as thoughtful. The new one would be described as impulsive, impatient, and reactive. Sound familiar? The old public square would have been viewed as tolerant. The new, intolerant. The old, civil. The new, angry and confrontational. The old public square, faith-based ideas and values are welcomed. The new public square, faith-based ideas and values are disdained. Those voices should be silenced. The old public square was slower, iterative communication. The new one is instant, spontaneous, real-time communication. And finally, the old was more obviously paper and voice-driven interaction, and now it's digital and social media-driven interaction. And so we're all living through a new change in how our culture functions and operates. And when we're living through it, we can tend to have two reactions. One is one of fear, and this is very real for a lot of people, and the fear means we start to back away, we start to put some walls up, we go, hey, we need to protect our way of life, our way of thinking. I'm not going to engage with those who aren't like me. And then the other one is to say, no, we have to engage. And so what I want to share with you this morning are sort of three words, three ways for us to think about what this moment requires of us. The first one is we have to be churches that release our people. Now this might sound counterintuitive unless you're a fisherman, right? If you've been fishing, you understand this idea of catch and release. You catch a fish, you reel it in, and then you release it to go back into its life. Well, in our churches, lots of time we put all our energy on catching, and we spend no energy thinking about how to release. What does it mean for somebody to become a disciple of Jesus, but to walk away from Sunday morning and into wherever they're headed Monday with a vision for what it means to be faithful in their new public square? We have to be doing that. A pastor friend in Charlottesville named Greg Thompson, he would describe this new moment we're in, and I think it's appropriate, as a new missionary age. It's a new missionary age. Os Guinness, another sociologist, a historian who's British, he looks at America and observes what's going on. He says, we're in a moment where there's a need for a third mission to the West. And he describes the first mission, second missions in the earlier centuries and says, in the 21st century, it is time for a new mission to the West, to the set of values and ideas that I just described. What will the Christian faith look like going forward into this kind of environment? You see, there's two approaches I'm seeing as I sort of talk with Christian leaders and pastors and spend time on college campuses and meet with the people who are leading many of your churches. And one reaction is to say we need to win back the way the culture was in 1970, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice if everybody sort of just agreed with Judeo-Christian ideas? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody agreed on what was right and wrong? Wouldn't it be nice if we just communicated via mail and paper? Right? There's sort of this old idea that we go, man, things just seemed easier and simpler. And if we could just get back to those times, those good old days, then the mission of God would just go forward in such a beautiful way. The other trajectory says, no, we're not going back there. We can wish for that all day long. That is not the future that we're about to live into. And while I love some things about that past, there's some incredible opportunities that exist today that didn't exist in that past. And so as we look towards this other trajectory, this other future, we go, wow, the world is feeling like it's falling apart at the seams, that there's some things going wrong, that people are waking up and going, this isn't working out. Relationships are breaking down. You look across our American cities the last couple years and you see the race dynamic that's erupted, right? And a lot of American Christians would have just said, man, we thought that was solved. We thought we'd worked that out in the 70s and the 80s. Well, guess what? We didn't. And guess what? There's more work to be doing right now within our communities. And there's an opportunity that comes with that. Or we look around and we see sexuality and identity questions and things that we never dealt with in the 70s. But now, 2015, front and center to every conversation you might have with a college student or somebody in a youth group. The church must be prepared to enter into this new place. And the more time we spend trying to get back to this old way, the less time we're spending walking into the missionary opportunity that God's giving us. You see, the church has always been at its best when it felt a little bit of pressure. Not when it sat in the seat of power, not when it had perfect alignment with the government. No, we always get kind of comfortable. We always get a little bit lazy. Being a Christian in America right now, do you realize 75% of Americans right now on a research study raise their hand and say they're Christian? Do you know how many of them actually read their Bible on a regular basis, believe church is a very important part of their life, believe their religion and their practices are essential to daily living? Do you know what that number is? 6%. So the days ahead are going to do some sorting for us, and I think the sorting will be really helpful. And I know you'll hear from Ed Stetzer throughout this. He's done a great job of sort of describing these dynamics that, look, there's about 25% of Christians who are, he would describe them as convictional Christians. Or we could call them practicing Christians. The practicing 25% of Christians in American life hasn't changed all that much in the last few decades. It's actually stayed pretty the same. What's changing is those who just claim to be a Christian, but it didn't mean much in their life, are no longer feeling the pressure socially to say I'm a Christian, because in America, being an atheist or agnostic or having no faith identity at all or just being spiritual is actually a lot more popular. And so that's some of the shift that we're seeing. But for those 25%, for those of you who are Christians, who are practicing Christians, who are convicted about your faith, it drives the way you think about your life. We have to put on a mentality of hope and how we're going to take hope into the world. Because what happens? You see, as the culture continues to play out its ideas about what really matters in life, that pleasure is all that matters, that I'm only accountable to myself, the consequences of this start to play out. I mean, I just think of like the news yesterday, right? Charlie Sheen. Wasn't it just 2 years ago that he was just huge on social media, showing off his debauchery and parties and talking about how he was winning? And now in the last couple of days, a much more somber mood as he realizes he has HIV? Of course, that's a sad, sad story and a cautionary tale, but it's another story of where these ideas go in a culture. And if the church just tries to keep up with the culture by being relevant to all things and all people, changing our views on theology, changing the way everything changes so that we can kind of reach a few people, the danger in that is when the world starts to break apart, when people start to experience some of the consequences of their decisions, the church isn't still sitting in its perfect place, able to give answers of hope and joy and what does this life look like and how am I supposed to live and what was I built and designed to do and how do human beings flourish the most? You see, those are the questions people will be asking today. In the 1970s, the question was, where will I go if I die tonight? And there was a reason people asked that question. There was a nuclear holocaust on the horizon that most of our parents thought was very real, that any night a nuclear bomb could be dropped and we could die. And so in the American context of conversation, thinking about death was very real. Well, today the question that college students have isn't where will I go if I die? The question is more, how do I live? What was I built to do? Where do I find mission and purpose in life? How will I flourish the most? And the Christian faith has the answers to those questions and always has. You see, as part of releasing, discipleship becomes critical. And discipleship is one of those things the church has woken up to. We're missing it. We're giving people great Sunday mornings. We're giving them some good teaching. We're giving them great technology. But are we really discipling people to be followers of Jesus? You see, I think of Matthew 28:19. In Matthew 28:19, this is part of the Great Commission. We've all heard it, but it's good to read it in the International Standard Version because it actually captures the way this was stated in the Greek perfectly. It says, therefore, as you go, disciple people in all nations. Most of us have heard the term, go and make disciples, right? And the emphasis is on going and making. The emphasis in the Greek was as you're going, so the assumption is you are constantly going. Every day you're going. Every day you're in meetings. Every day you're meeting with new partnerships. You're meeting with people on your teams. Every day you're with your family or with children or with friends. Every day you're going. And as you're going, disciple. You see, the verb there is disciple. It wasn't a noun, make disciples. It is to disciple, which means we as the church have to know, how are we bringing followers of Jesus up all around us? You know, other faiths have kind of figured this out. Other faiths have realized what it means to ask people to actually follow their faith. I lived in New York the last several years, and I remember, if you've flown into New York, I'm sure many of you have, you fly into LaGuardia Airport. There's sort of that interesting exit. You jump in a cab and you start driving out of LaGuardia, and you come around a curve, and I remember I caught it probably 8 out of 10 times. I would look over, and behind one of these buildings where all the taxi cab drivers kind of wait in their lines till it's their turn, and no less than 3 to 5 to 7 people down on a prayer mat, kneeling and praying with their shoes off. Taxi cab drivers. Now, do you think their faith means something to them? It does. They've decided to alter their life. They've decided to get out of their car. They've decided to take off their shoes. They've decided to follow some practices and some rhythms that help them remember what they believe this world's about. Now, for Christians, we don't always do that, do we? And I'm not suggesting we need to get into some deeply religious environment and make everything liturgical and everybody has to follow every single of the same practices. But what I'm suggesting is, when we start to disciple people, faith becomes more serious and important in their life. And I think it's a time in 2015 where this is a very appropriate focus, where we have an opportunity as a church to look back and go, how is our facility, how is our property, how is everything that we're able to control to facilitate this mission going to help Christians start to understand how to live into a rhythm that helps them become more like Christ, so that we can be all that Christ wants us to be in the world. Dorothy Sayers, a famous writer of the 20th century, said this, and she was talking about the Christian faith. She said, "How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life?" How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life? This is what I'm talking about. Church on Sunday morning is like 1/10 of your life. 9/10 of your life will be lived outside of a church building. And the Christian faith has always put its emphasis towards those 9/10. The church is always meant to be the place to gather and to send out, to release, to say, go and be. As you're going, make disciples. And you show up here on Sunday morning, and we're going to equip you, and we're going to help you know how to do that, but we're counting on you for the mission of God to go forward. We're not counting on this church. We're not counting on this service. We're not counting on this teacher. You see, Paul writes in Corinthians to the church, and he says, you have 10,000 teachers, but you don't have any fathers. You have 10,000 teachers, but you don't have any fathers. I think the American church is sitting in a moment where we have 10,000 teachers, but we're lacking in fathers. And for the days ahead, it's going to require fathering. It's going to require the church to be in a place where we don't just have services that inspire people, but we truly are equipping them to know how to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, live this out. Now, how do we do that? You see, practically, when you think about a church congregation, and this is a lot of what we talk about at Q, which, by the way, our Q conference, the Q stands for questions. So we try to create this place annually where 1,500 leaders come together from all over the country, some from around the world, and we basically engage what are the next questions coming for our culture in the next 12 months. And so we dig into every kind of topic you can imagine. And we do that in a way that says, look, as Christians, we understand that the Christian faith has something to say to every single thing in our world. We don't have to shy away from any topic because we believe the good news is the good news, and it will show up in any topic, any conversation, any subject matter, that there's a way we as Christians can engage that, and it's been a great 10-year journey to start to see that instilling confidence in people. And one of the things that we talk about a lot at Q are the 7 channels of culture. You've probably heard this in different ways. Maybe people call them the spheres of culture and other things, and there's no perfect science to this. But the idea is these 7 channels of culture touch every citizen in your city. And there's media, there's arts and entertainment, there's business, there's education, there's the government, there's the social sector, and there's the church. And all 7 of these are where most of the people that are part of your church, this is where they spend 5 or 6 days a week. Now, for those of you who are on staff with the church, you spend a lot of your time in the church channel. And this is good. But if we don't understand that the other 6 is where a lot of life is happening every week, as the church, sometimes we can misappropriate our time, our energy, and how we think we're going to make a difference in the world. So when we talk about releasing people, we're releasing them to be agents of renewal within these different areas of culture. And so as a pastor, or anytime, it may be a worship leader, or a technician, anybody who's on stage like I am right now, and I look out, and if you were my congregation, you know what I should see? I shouldn't just see a bunch of people that I, as a pastor or leader, think, man, they're really spiritually hungry. They're here this week to hear something from me. I'm going to nourish them this morning. That should not be my only thought. My thought should be, I'm looking at teachers, business professionals, people that are working in our city government, people who are working in the foster care and adoption centers across our city, people who are donating their time and energy and money to several nonprofits. I see people who are developing new technologies. I see people who are innovating and creating co-working spaces within our city. Oh, I see somebody who's a real estate entrepreneur who's actually buying up a lot of land around here. And as a pastor, I start to go, wow, the church is on mission. How do I get behind them and help them do that well? How do I help them be disciples that are then discipling others as they're going? And this is where we get to the renewal part of our mission. So it's not just release, but it's a vision for renewal. And if our churches could start to come alive to people seeing that God's called the teacher into a classroom to be a renewal agent for the kingdom of God, then all of a sudden people get pretty excited in your church. Church isn't just about coming to a service on a Sunday and kind of going through the rituals. No, I have to be at church on Sunday. It's the only place I'm getting fed so that I can go back out and I can be, as a teacher, a better teacher. I can actually deal with parents that are in difficult situations. I can have compassion for students who didn't get their homework done because of dealing with crazy circumstances in their home. And I'm going to know better as a teacher how the gospel and the good news could show up as a teacher in my local public school. Or for the architect. The architect comes to church and goes, man, I love design, I love beauty, I love creating things. And they leave church going, I am fired up that I'm supposed to go into this new architecture firm I just created, and I'm supposed to submit some designs for the local city park, and I'm going to do a better job of doing that because I want the local city park to reflect the beauty of God's creation. I want to celebrate what's true about this world. And I want to make sure we have some monuments and some other things within this park that tell the truth about this city. You know, this starts to apply to every area of life. I think of my friend, a guy named Sid Mashburn. He's just down the road in Atlanta. He's a designer. He's a Christian guy who's, I don't know if anybody remembers J. Crew in the late 80s or early 90s, but does anybody remember the barn jacket? Remember the barn jacket with the little corduroy? So this guy designed the barn jacket, okay? That's what I would say is he's famous for, is designing the barn jacket. He went on and created his own company called Sid Mashburn, and it's a store that's frequented by anybody who goes through Atlanta who's into fashion, who kind of understands all of this stuff. Like, they just love his shop, okay? He's just curated a beautiful shop. But an example of how Sid thinks about his faith is when you go into Sid's shop, you don't just see a bunch of clothes, but instead what Sid says is, look, in most stores, the people who are the tailors, the ones who are doing the hard work of building these suits, of hemming the garments, usually they're in a back room, like you never see them, right? Maybe they come out and put some chalk on something and then they're gone. Well, he's like, this is the most beautiful art I ever watch. I love to see these guys work. It's masterful. It's beautiful to watch them create a new suit. And so what does he do? In the middle of his floor in his store, the tailors are sitting there. And when you walk into a store, you see them through the windows. And when you're walking around the store, you see them doing their work. Now, you might say, oh, that's no big deal. That's not good news. No, it is good news. You know what it is? In his industry, he's changing the standard about how they value their employees, how they think about the people who do the work, where they source their material. See, this is the gospel starting to flow through into every area of life. And if you've ever been in your church and thought, man, people feel a little dead, it feels like they're not getting it, it feels like they don't even want to be here, it's partly because they're not understanding how the gospel calls them into the place that they've been as an outpost of the kingdom to start to live out everything that God wants that industry, those people, that team, the people they work with to experience. You see, the final word is restoration. So we have to release, we have to inspire people towards renewal, but we have to help them understand, what does it mean to restore? What does it mean to see things as they ought to be and then live into that? And what is it that the church can do to actually support people in knowing how to live through the difficult times that we're living in? You see, when we think about restoration, I think we just think about the church. We think about a church that understands its place in a community. You know, there's some churches where their doors are open on Sunday morning, and then pretty much during the week, they're not really that engaged. They don't do a lot. There's not a lot happening within the community. And lots of times there's frustration about that. People are going, man, we have this great building, we should use it. But, you know, and there's tension around that. Well, what I'm seeing in the American church are churches who are starting to say, no, we have this awesome facility. Let's use it. Let's bless our community every chance we can get, whether it's with high school graduations and using it for that, or whether it's hosting amazing things. Like my son, who's 14, he's part of something called Young Life Capernaum. And Young Life Capernaum is a group of children with special needs. My son has Down syndrome. So he's 14 years old, and Young Life has created this amazing group where 50 special needs kids come out and all these volunteers, but we always need a church to meet in. Well, Brentwood Baptist, just up the road, they're the church that allows this group to meet within their church on Monday nights. And it is an incredible blessing to Young Life. It's an incredible blessing. Lots of churches don't even know that exists. They may not even know that need exists. But there are so many needs within our communities where they need to use our facilities. I think of the church as we think about our land and our buildings and our technology. In the days ahead, it will be needed to form Christians. And I know in theory we kind of believe that, but I think you see the urgency when you see what Rod Dreher says. Rod's a writer with the American Conservative, but he's somebody who was on Time Magazine recently as declaring the Benedict option. How many of you have ever heard the words the Benedict option? Anybody? So the Benedict option is being discussed in this year of time as in a post kind of Supreme Court ruling world. A bunch of Christian intellectuals are saying, look, maybe what Christians need to do is really just go focus on our own institutions. We can't trust that we're going to be able to pass on our faith to the next generation and to the next generation unless we get really serious about institutionalizing what it looks like to be a household, what it looks like to be a family of faith. He says this, he says, the Benedict option refers to Christians in the contemporary West who are keen to construct local forms of community as loci of Christian resistance against what the empire represents. Put less grandly, it is for Christians who recognize that forming Christians who live out Christianity according to great tradition requires embedding within communities and institutions dedicated to that formation. Now that's a lot of words for this. Our churches are going to have to become the place that Christians can rely on to form them, to be where they're finding other people, to find how they can support one another in the days ahead. You know, slowly and slowly, as we think about religious liberty discussions and all that's happening in our culture, the common belief among most Americans is your faith should just stay underneath the roof of your building. Now, that was never what religious freedom meant. It's never been what the First Amendment was about. But in common American thinking right now, that's what it's about. And so that's a negative in the terms of we should be able to publicly express our faith and live out our faith. That's part of being human. It's part of us living by our conscience. The positive is, as we go as Christians, we are going to utilize these institutions to develop people, to help them understand what it means to be Christian and how to go out and live that out. And that's going to require programs, which many of you have. It's going to require leveraging the land and the buildings for all kinds of opportunities, for Christian ministries, for people within your community who need a space to meet, to congregate, to work. And we don't go there because we're trying to avoid the world and become more of a subculture. No. But we see our churches as a place that's not just about Sunday morning. It's not just about an experience. It's about a place that's going to be used to cultivate the inner life, to form people, to know what it means to be disciples. So the church has to be a place to love. The church has to be a place to form people. And then the church has to be a place to send people. I think of one of our worship leaders, a guy named Zach Williams in Brooklyn at our church, Trinity Grace Church. Well, he was a worship leader, but on the side he also wrote music, and he started this band called the Lone Bellow. And as he was creating this band, there was this dilemma, because he's a worship pastor. That's kind of where he's making his living. It's the way that he's operating. But because he was in a community that understood this concept of sending, his pastor said, we can't keep you to ourselves, Zach. God's given you a gift. He's given you a talent. We want to support you as you go out on the road. We're going to support your family while you're gone. We're going to do everything we can to help you as a band have the opportunity for the world to start to feel some of the salt and light that you put forward in the truth of your music and in your lyrics. And a church that's a sending church celebrates that moment. They don't feel bad about it. They don't lament that they've lost one of their great leaders. No, they celebrate with the leader to say, we're going to help you go out and do mission. You know what else a sending church does? They don't only call up groups of people that are about to go on short-term missions trips to pray for them. Now, this is a good practice. Of course, we should pray for groups that are commissioned to go out. But you know what sending churches do? They pull up all of the school teachers from their community that are part of their church the week before school starts, and the whole congregation prays over the school teachers. And they pull up the doctors and the nurses who are responding and the firemen and the police who are taking care of communities, and they bring them on stage one Sunday, and the whole community prays for them. And they bring the business leaders and the entrepreneurs up on stage, and the whole community prays for the most creativity, innovation, new ideas that will spark their economies, that will help lead to more flourishing in their communities. And they pray for them because the church understands that this is the church. The church isn't a Sunday morning experience. The church is all week long, and it's all of us. And our Sunday experiences play one small role in that. You know, we've had the privilege with Q over the last 2 years to do something to try to illustrate what does it look like for the church to be a place to lead in their communities. Because obviously, we see in our churches today that we're in a place where churches aren't even invited to many of the conversations anymore. You know, it used to be back, I don't know if you remember Little House on the Prairie. Anybody would admit to watching Little House on the Prairie? Walnut Grove, right? Remember Pastor, I don't know what his name was, Charles maybe? But the meeting house of the church, the little white house, that's where school took place, right? It's where church took place. It's where they had the fellowship sort of outings and played softball. It's right in the town square. And anything happening in that town was going to go through the church. Well, today the church is on the periphery. We're not invited into those conversations. So what does it mean for the church to start to lead again? What does it mean for us to start bringing our vision for human flourishing and our cities to flourish? What does it mean for us to enter the public square? And so it's been amazing for us to see. We've had over 100 cities participate in this thing called Q Commons. C-O-M-M-O-N-S, Q Commons. And what we did was we partnered with cities, we partnered with churches in those cities, and we said, what if on one night we all came together in all these cities, about 70 of them in the U.S., we've had about 20 around the world, like Sydney, Australia, Edinburgh. What if we on one night did something together really interesting? And what we'll do is we'll provide 3 great talks from like Malcolm Gladwell or Tim Keller and people that you wouldn't normally have access to in your community to talk about the common good, to talk about what it means to engage culture. And then what if you picked 3 people in your local community that your community needs to hear from, where you could celebrate what's going really well in culture, where you could maybe talk about the things that are confusing, where people need to get involved, where you could educate your local community, and we could kind of partner up and have this really big global conversation, and on the same evening have a very local, applicable, practical conversation. And we've just been blown away over the last 2 years. We've had 3 of these different events. Churches continue to reach out, wanting to do more. We can't even keep up with it because they're seeing this as a tool on a Thursday night, not a Sunday, right, to invite their community in and to say, here's what we believe as a church. We do care about our city. In fact, our mayor's going to give a talk on Thursday night to tell you what's going on in our city. Our police chief's going to share with you what's been happening in the violence area of our community. Or a local leader of a nonprofit's going to share with you what's been taking place within our community, one of the needs that we need to meet, and so on and so forth. Half of these are happening in church buildings. Half of them are happening in public venues like museums and theaters and so on and so forth. But what we have found is there's a hunger within the church today to say we want to be engaged in these conversations, but we just don't know how. So part of the deal is you and I have to have courage. We have to have courage in this moment to continue to lead. We can't draw back. We can't say, let's go cower in the corner and build the walls. We have to say, what does it mean for us to be intelligent and to lead? I think of Daniel in the Old Testament, right? In Daniel 6. He ends up in Babylon, and he's viewed as somebody who's educated. I would describe him as probably a cosmopolitan leader, right? He was educated. He was probably handsome. He dressed probably decently well. And the king said, I want this guy to be a part of what I'm doing in the kingdom. And he invites him in. But Daniel still had to have the courage to keep his practices alive. He couldn't exist in this cosmopolitan empire without practicing prayer, right? And that's why he ends up in the lion's den, because they sign an ordinance and say, you can't pray anymore. He goes back. The scripture says in Daniel 6, he knows that the ordinance has been signed, and he goes back to his home, he opens the windows, and he continues to pray 3 times a day. So what we have to do is form people within our churches that get that know how to live within the empire, who know how to exist within our cities and in our culture, but also know how to go home and get on their knees and open their windows and pray to the God who gives us the power to actually live within this environment. And I think when we start to do that, we start to present an option to the world that they haven't really seen a lot of lately. They start to be people who are not fearful but have a lot of joy, who have a lot of hope for a future, who understand why we exist as humans and how we'll flourish the most, who are willing to invite people into that, not keep them out of it, but say, hey, come with me. Let's come participate. Roll up your sleeves. Let's do this together. Let's create together. Let's learn together. And I think when we do that, we will start to see a church that comes to life. And we're seeing it in little pockets. We're seeing it in certain cities. But on large part, it's just the innovators doing it. But I think in the days ahead, we'll look 5, 10 years from now, we'll see more and more churches embracing, understanding how to release their people, understanding how to renew their cities, their industries, their cultures, thinking that's common language within the church. And finally, knowing what it means to restore. Let me pray for us. Father, we just thank you for this morning. We thank you for this group of people who's assembled. I know over the next couple of days, there's so much they'll be taking in, so much information. They'll be looking at all kinds of great technologies and learning about how to do their jobs better and meeting so many other people that are going to fire so much creativity. I just ask that you'll direct that energy towards your purposes for the days ahead. That they'll be reminded of their first love, why they're even doing this to start with. Help us not be too captivated by just all the gadgets and all the things we could do, but that we'll get back to the beginning of like, what are we designed to do? What is this thing even about? How do we leverage what we get to do in our churches to be a part of what God's trying to do to see his kingdom advance in the days ahead? God, give us wisdom as we make those choices. Bring the right people to us. Give us favor within our communities. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.